Hi guys.
The marketplace was one of the busiest places in any village. It opened once a week, usually on a Wednesday or Thursday, and people came from nearby farms with chickens, eggs, wool and vegetables. Some brought old tools, broken pots, or clothes that no longer fit. Others came to buy, to bargain, or just to stand around and listen to news. It was where people learned who was sick, who was marrying, who had lost a cow or found a stray dog. Life moved through the market, slow and steady, like a cart on a muddy road. Among all the usual trades now and then, a man would bring his wife, not as a customer, not as a helper, but as something to be handed over. She would stand near the well or by the butcher's stall, quiet, hands folded, perhaps holding a basket or a child. The rope, when used, was not dramatic. It wasn't thick or tight, more like a piece of twine used for tying up parcels. Sometimes it was looped around her wrist. Other times it dangled from the husband's hand like a leash no one was pulling. No announcements were made with music or shouting. The husband might simply say he was selling his wife, or just stand in a noticeable spot until someone asked. There was no auctioneer, no bell to mark the start. It happened the way many things happened back then, without ceremony, but with a kind of quiet understanding that this was how it was done. The price was rarely high, a few coins, if any. Often it was goods, a sack of grain, a pair of boots, a live hen, or a jug of ale. In one case it was a length of cloth and a promise to pay for her shoes when they wore out. The value wasn't in the exchange, but in the act. It gave the change a shape. Without it, the whole thing might have looked like running away or stealing. With it, it became a transaction. Not legal, not approved, but at least it followed a pattern. Buyers were usually men from the same village or a nearby one, often widowers or bachelors who had never married. Some were younger, some older, but all in need of a partner for daily life. Not for love, not for company, but for the work that needed doing. A house needed managing. A farm needed help. A man living alone was seen as incomplete, like a cart with one wheel. Sometimes the buyer was already known to the wife. They might have spoken before, shared a look, even agreed in private that this would happen. There are records of wives being sold to men they had been seen walking with, or who had helped them during harvest. In those cases, the market was just a formality, a way to make the change public, so no one could later say it was improper. People watching didn't usually react with horror. Some laughed, not out of cruelty, but because anything unusual could be funny after a long week of rain and potatoes. Others offered advice like they would at any sale. Check her teeth, or make sure she can milk. It was treated like any other trade, even if the item being traded was a person. The church said marriage could not be undone. But the church also said many things that didn't fit village life, like fasting during harvest or not working on holy days when the weather was good. So people made allowances. As long as no one was hurt and the new couple didn't cause trouble, there was no reason to stop it. Constables rarely interfered. There was no law against wife selling. Not exactly. It wasn't listed in the books. If someone complained, the authorities might ask questions, but often dropped it when they saw it was peaceful. One judge, when told of a sale, reportedly said it was a foolish custom, but no harm done, and went back to his tea. Women did not always stand passively. Some records suggest they spoke during the sale, pointed to the man they wanted, or even refused an offer. In one case, a woman was said to have kicked a bidder and walked away with her husband. It wasn't all control and silence. There were moments of choice, small but real. The rope was not always used. In some places, a leather strap was placed in the buyer's hand. In others, the wife simply walked to the new man and stood beside him. The symbol was enough. It showed that the old bond was broken and a new one formed, not by the church, not by law, but by agreement among people who lived close to the ground and had little use for fine words. When it was over, the new couple left together. No celebration, no feast. Just a walk home, like any other evening. The market went on. Chickens were sold, boots were tried on, life continued, as it always did, one small step at a time. The marketplace was one of the busiest places in any village. It opened once a week, usually on a Wednesday or Thursday, and people came from nearby farms with chickens, eggs, wool, and vegetables. Some brought old tools, broken pots, or clothes that no longer fit. Others came to buy, to bargain, or just to stand around and listen to news. It was where people learned who was sick, who was marrying, who had lost a cow, or found a stray dog. Life moved through the market, slow and steady, like a cart on a muddy road. Among all the usual trades now and then, a man would bring his wife, not as a customer, not as a helper, but as something to be handed over. She would stand near the well, or by the butcher's stall, quiet, hands folded, perhaps holding a basket or a child. The rope, when used, was not dramatic. It wasn't thick or tight, more like a piece of twine used for tying up parcels. Sometimes it was looped around her wrist. Other times it dangled from the husband's hand like a leash no one was pulling. No announcements were made with music or shouting. The husband might simply say he was selling his wife, or just stand in a noticeable spot until someone asked. There was no auctioneer, no bell to mark the start. It happened the way many things happened back then, without ceremony, but with a kind of quiet understanding that this was how it was done. The price was rarely high, a few coins, if any. Often it was goods, a sack of grain, a pair of boots, a live hen, or a jug of ale. In one case it was a length of cloth and a promise to pay for her shoes when they wore out. The value wasn't in the exchange, but in the act. It gave the change a shape. Without it, the whole thing might have looked like running away or stealing. With it, it became a transaction. Not legal, not approved, but at least it followed a pattern. Buyers were usually men from the same village or a nearby one, often widowers or bachelors who had never married. Some were younger, some older, but all in need of a partner for daily life. Not for love, not for company, but for the work that needed doing. A house needed managing. A farm needed help. A man living alone was seen as incomplete, like a cart with one wheel. Sometimes the buyer was already known to the wife. They might have spoken before, shared a look, even agreed in private that this would happen. There are records of wives being sold to men they had been seen walking with, or who had helped them during harvest. In those cases, the market was just a formality, a way to make the change public, so no one could later say it was improper. People watching didn't usually react with horror. Some laughed, not out of cruelty, but because anything unusual could be funny after a long week of rain and potatoes. Others offered advice like they would at any sale. Check her teeth, or make sure she can milk. It was treated like any other trade, even if the item being traded was a person. The church said marriage could not be undone. But the church also said many things that didn't fit village life, like fasting during harvest or not working on holy days when the weather was good. So people made allowances. As long as no one was hurt and the new couple didn't cause trouble, there was no reason to stop it. Constables rarely interfered. There was no law against wife selling. Not exactly. It wasn't listed in the books. If someone complained, the authorities might ask questions, but often dropped it when they saw it was peaceful. One judge, when told of a sale, reportedly said it was a foolish custom, but no harm done, and went back to his tea. Women did not always stand passively. Some records suggest they spoke during the sale, pointed to the man they wanted, or even refused an offer. In one case, a woman was said to have kicked a bidder and walked away with her husband. It wasn't all control and silence. There were moments of choice, small but real. The rope was not always used. In some places, a leather strap was placed in the buyer's hand. In others, the wife simply walked to the new man and stood beside him. The symbol was enough. It showed that the old bond was broken and a new one formed, not by the church, not by law, but by agreement among people who lived close to the ground and had little use for fine words. When it was over, the new couple left together. No celebration, no feast. just to walk home, like any other evening. The market went on. Chickens were sold, boots were tried on, life continued, as it always did, one small step at a time. The process of selling a wife had no official rules, but it followed a kind of pattern that people understood. It wasn't spontaneous, not usually. Most sales were talked about beforehand, quietly, between neighbours or over a drink at the alehouse. The husband might mention he was thinking of letting her go, and someone might ask who to. There was no secrecy, but no loud announcements either. It was handled like a repair to a fence, nothing special, but best done properly. When the day came, the market was the usual place. Not because it was a stage, but because it was where people gathered. The wife would arrive with her husband, often dressed no differently than on any other day. A plain dress, a shawl, practical shoes. She might carry a basket or hold a child, not as a show, but because that was normal. The rope, when used, was not new. It was likely something from the barn or kitchen, a bit of old twine or leather. Nothing made for the occasion. The husband would stand in a clear spot, not too close to the fish stall, where the smell was strong, and not too far from the path where people walked. He didn't shout, but he didn't hide either. If someone asked, he would say his wife was for sale. That was enough. No speeches, no reasons given. The why didn't matter to most people. The what was clear. Offers came slowly. A man might step forward and name a price. It was often low. A few pence, a loaf of bread, a tool. One sale was settled for a gallon of beer and a promise to keep her warm in winter. The price wasn't the point. It was the exchange that counted. Money or goods made it look like a proper trade, not an escape or a fight. It gave the change a shape people could accept. Sometimes there was more than one offer. Not a bidding war, nothing loud or frantic. Just two men saying they would take her, then a quiet word between them, or with the husband. In some cases, the wife was asked who she would go with. Not always, but sometimes. There are accounts of women pointing to one man and turning away from another. No one called it a vote, but it happened. The new husband would then take her hand or simply walk beside her. The rope, if it had been used, was untied or handed over. No one burned it or kept it as a trophy. It was put aside like any other bit of string. The old husband would stay a moment, then leave. No tears, no anger, no handshake, just a quiet end. It wasn't a happy event, but it wasn't always a sad one. Some women may have felt relief. If the first marriage had been cold or harsh, the new one might bring kindness. Some buyers were known to be gentle, hard-working, or simply better at speaking than listening. A fresh start, even an odd one, could feel like luck. The church did not approve. Marriage was a sacrament, not a thing to be passed on like a borrowed pot. But the church had little reach in small villages. The nearest priest might come once a month, and even then, he had more to worry about than broken marriages. If a couple later came to him for a blessing, he might give it, not because he agreed with how they got together, but because they were already living as man and wife, and causing no trouble. Courts ignored most cases. There was no law against wife selling, not directly. Judges saw it as a village matter, not one for the bench. If someone complained, the case might be heard, but usually dismissed. One magistrate wrote in a note that, though the practice is vulgar and unchristian, no crime has been committed if all parties agree. He added, let them sort it among themselves, and closed the file. The sale was not always permanent. Some couples split again after a season or two, others stayed together for years. Children were born, homes kept, winters survived. No one kept records of how many worked out, but some clearly did. A woman sold to a kind man might live better than before. A man who bought a capable wife might find his life easier. It wasn't love, not in the stories, but it was peace. People needed ways to change their lives when no proper way existed. Laws were slow, religion was strict, and leaving a marriage without reason could bring shame. Selling a wife was not kind, not legal, not right in any official sense, but it was simple. It was quiet. It did not bring the constable to the door or the priest with a scolding. And in a world where most things were hard, a simple way out, even a strange one, was better than none. The rope, the market, the few coins, they were not a solution, not really. But they were a way forward, one step at a time, without breaking anything too badly. Life went on, not because it was fair, but because it had to. Not everyone who bought a wife did so on impulse. Most had thought about it for some time. They were usually men who had lived alone for years, perhaps after the death of a spouse, or who had never managed to marry. Living solo was not easy. Cooking, cleaning, mending, and working the land alone took more effort than two could manage together. A man without a woman in the house was often seen as incomplete, like a plough without a blade. He might get by, but he wouldn't get far. The buyers were not wealthy. They were farmers, labourers, or small traders. Some were older, their best years behind them. Others were younger but overlooked, maybe shy, poor, or known for keeping to themselves. They weren't the kind of men women usually chose. So when a wife became available through sale, it gave them a chance. They wouldn't have had otherwise. It wasn't romance, it was opportunity. Some of these men already knew the women they bought. They might have spoken at harvest, shared a task, or seen each other at market for years. In quiet villages, people noticed who got along. A nod, a shared smile, helping with a heavy sack. Small things, but enough to suggest a match. The sale was not the beginning, but the end of a slow agreement. It made public what had already been decided in private. There were cases where the buyer had helped the wife before the sale. He might have fixed her roof, brought firewood, or stood up for her when her husband was harsh. These acts were not grand, but they meant something. They showed care without words. When the husband announced the sale, the helpful neighbour was often the first to offer and the one most likely to be accepted. Women did not always have a say, but sometimes they did. There are records of wives refusing offers, stepping back from men they didn't want, or clearly indicating their preference. One account mentions a woman who stayed silent until a certain man spoke, then nodded and walked to him without waiting for the rope to be passed. No one stopped her. It was understood that even in such a strange custom, some choice was allowed. The idea that a wife was just a piece of property doesn't fit all the cases. In many, she was more like a partner being reassigned. The buyer wasn't claiming ownership so much as taking on responsibility. He promised to feed her, house her, and treat her fairly. That promise, spoken in front of witnesses, was often enough. No paper, no seal, but a word given in public carried weight. Some sales happened because the original husband could no longer care for his wife. He might be too old, too ill, or too poor. Rather than leave her to struggle or rely on the parish, he arranged for her to go to someone who could provide. In these cases, the sale was less about ending a marriage and more about ensuring her future. The new husband took her not out of desire, but duty. Not all buyers were kind, of course. There were men who wanted a servant, not a partner. Some saw the sale as a way to get a woman without her family's approval or the trouble of courtship. But even then the system had a limit. A woman who was mistreated might leave, or the village might turn against the man. Reputation mattered. A man known for cruelty found it harder to trade, borrow, or get help when needed. The practice wasn't common, but it wasn't rare either. It appeared in different parts of England, from the south coast to the North Moors. It lasted for centuries, not because it was right, but because it worked well enough. It filled a gap where the law and the church offered nothing. People needed a way to change their lives when stuck in a bad situation. This was one of the few ways available. Buyers didn't see themselves as doing anything wrong. They weren't stealing or tricking anyone. The husband agreed, the wife was present. The exchange happened in public. To them it was fair. Not elegant, not blessed, but honest in its own rough way. They weren't breaking rules so much as using a loophole that everyone pretended not to see. After the sale, life went on. The new couple moved in together. She cooked in his kitchen. He worked the land. Neighbours might comment, but they didn't interfere. If the pair seemed content, that was the end of it. No one expected perfection, just peace, order, and enough food to get through the winter. It wasn't love, not in the way songs described it, but it was stability, and for many that was enough. A shared roof, a warm meal, someone to speak to at the end of the day. These were not small things. They were the quiet comforts that made life bearable, even in hard times. The sale didn't fix everything. It couldn't guarantee happiness or stop arguments, but it allowed movement where there had been none. It gave people a way to leave a bad match and try another, without scandal or long disputes. It was clumsy, awkward, and often looked foolish from the outside. But inside the village, where people knew the real struggles, it made sense. No one celebrated, no one wrote it down as a triumph. But when a woman walked away with a man who treated her better, when a lonely man finally had help and warmth in his home, the custom had done its job. Not because it was good, but because it was possible. And sometimes that was the only difference that mattered. The price paid for a wife was rarely about money, it was about form. A small exchange made the change feel real, like a handshake after an agreement. The amount was usually low, sometimes symbolic. A shilling, a few pence, a loaf of bread, a jug of ale. In one case it was a pair of boots and a promise to mend the roof before winter. In another, a live goose and a week's worth of firewood. The goods changed hands not because they were valuable, but because something had to. Without an exchange, the act might have looked like running away or kidnapping. With it, even a tiny one, it became a transaction. Not legal, not approved, but at least it followed a pattern people understood. Markets were for trading. If you wanted to change something important, doing it where trades happened made it seem less strange. The value of the wife was not measured in coins. It was measured in what she could do. Could she cook? Keep a clean house? Work in the fields? Have children? These were the real questions. A woman who could do all these things was worth more than one who could not. But the price rarely reflected that. Most sales were settled for the same small sum, no matter the woman's age or skill. It was not a market in the modern sense. There were no bargains or rip-offs, just a quiet agreement wrapped in a gesture. Sometimes no money changed hands at all. The buyer might offer a service instead, to help the old husband with his harvest, to repair his fence, or to care for him in old age. In one case, a man took a woman in exchange for looking after her husband's sheep for a year. The deal was not about profit, but balance. Something given, something received. That was enough. The church taught that marriage could not be bought or sold. People knew that, but they also knew that survival came before doctrine. A man who could not feed his family did not stop to read scripture. A woman stuck in a cold, angry home did not wait for a bishop's permission to leave. They used what was available, the market, the rope, the few coins. These were tools, not sins. Some sales were clearly arranged in advance. The price was agreed weeks before, not decided on the spot. The public exchange was just a show, a way to make it official in the eyes of the village. The real deal had already been made in private, over a fence or during a walk. The market was the stage, not the start. There are records of wives being sold for less than a pig. A pig could feed a family for weeks. A wife was expected to do that and more. Yet the price was often the same. This was not because she was worth less, but because the price was not really about worth. It was about closure. Paying something, anything, meant the old marriage was over. The husband had let go. The new man had taken on the role. The number of coins did not matter. In some cases, the woman brought something with her. A few clothes, a cooking pot, a small sum of money saved over years. This was not part of the sale, but her own property. It showed she was not starting from nothing. She had her own small value, separate from the exchange. No one called it a dowry, but it served a similar purpose. The humour in all this was quiet, almost unnoticed. A man might joke that he got a better deal than at the livestock auction. Another might say his new wife was cheaper than a new plough, but more useful. These were not cruel words, not always. They were the kind of dry remarks people made when faced with something awkward. Laughter helped smooth over what could not be fixed properly. No receipts were given, no records kept. The sale existed only in memory and witness. If someone later questioned it, the only proof was what people saw and heard. A man standing with his wife, another man offering something, the rope passing from one hand to another. That was the evidence. Thin, but enough for village life. The practice did not last because it was fair. It lasted because it worked. It gave people a way to move on when no better option existed. The price was small, but the change it allowed was large. A fresh start, a quieter home, a kinder voice at supper. It was never elegant, never dignified. But in a world with little comfort and less choice, it was a way forward. Not because it was right, but because it was possible. And sometimes that was all people needed. A small gesture, a few coins, a goose, and life, slowly, beginning again. The church and the law looked down on wife-selling, though not always in the same way. The church saw marriage as a holy bond, one that could not be broken by human hands. To sell a wife was to treat a sacrament like a sack of grain. It was vulgar, unchristian, and against the teachings of the Bible. Priests were expected to condemn it, and some did, from the pulpit or in private. But many others said nothing. The matter rarely reached the altar, and when it did, it was often handled quietly. In villages, the priest might be more concerned with whether people attended Sunday service than how they arranged their homes. If a couple lived together peacefully, went to church, and raised their children properly, he was unlikely to question how they got there. The sale had already happened. Undoing it would only cause more trouble. So, while the practice was never blessed, it was often tolerated. A blind eye was easier than a fight. The law was slower still. There were no statutes that said, "It is illegal to sell your wife." No court had a form for such a case. Wife-selling existed in a gap, not allowed, not punished. It was seen as a village oddity, a rough custom among common people, not worth the time of magistrates. If a complaint was made, it usually came from a relative or a rival, not the woman herself. Even then, the case often went nowhere. Judges tended to dismiss such matters. One recorded case ended with the magistrate saying the sale had no legal standing, but also that no crime had been committed, so he would not interfere. Another wrote in the margin of a report, "Foolish but peaceful," and moved on to cases of theft and assault. The courts were busy with real crimes. A quiet transfer between neighbours, even a strange one, was not a priority. Constables rarely got involved unless there was violence or a public disturbance. If the sale happened without shouting, fighting, or damage to property, they saw no reason to step in. Some even stood and watched, like any other villager. One officer later said he had seen 3 such sales in his time and never stopped one because they always seemed settled and the woman usually looked relieved. The authorities preferred order over justice when the two clashed. A messy divorce case could drag on for years. A wife selling, however odd, was quick. It had witnesses. It had an agreement. It ended with a new household forming, not a woman on the street or a man in jail. From a distance, it looked like chaos. Up close, it often looked like a solution. Newspapers in the 18th and 19th centuries began to report on the practice, usually with mockery. They called it barbaric, a relic of ignorance, a stain on civilization. Articles described the rope, the market, the low price, with a tone of disbelief. Yet even in their criticism, there was a hint of amusement. The idea of selling a wife like a pig was too strange not to be funny. Still, the reports helped end the custom. As towns grew and laws became clearer, informal solutions lost ground. Courts started to treat wife-selling as a form of cruelty or fraud. Police were told to intervene. The old ways were replaced by separation orders, desertion cases, and later, divorce laws. The market was no longer a place to change your life. Yet for all the disapproval, No one offered a better alternative for ordinary people. Divorce was expensive, rare, and required proof of serious wrongdoing, like adultery or cruelty. Most couples had neither the money nor the evidence. They were trapped unless they found a way around the rules. Wife selling was not the answer, but it was an answer. Some magistrates admitted in private that while the practice was absurd, it served a purpose. One wrote that the poor must have some way to escape a wretched marriage, even if it is not the way we would choose. He did not approve, but he understood. The church never accepted it, but the church also never provided a path for the unhappily married. It offered prayer, patience, and endurance. These were noble ideals, but they did not feed children or warm a cold house. In the gap between belief and reality, people made their own choices. Wife selling was never legal, never official, never right in the eyes of the law or God, but it was real. And in moments when no proper way forward existed, it became a path anyway, not because it was good, but because it was there. A rope, a few words, a small exchange, and life moved on, quietly, without breaking anything too badly. After the sale was done, life went on much like before, only with a different man in the house. The woman moved to her new home, sometimes the same village, sometimes a nearby farm. There was no ceremony, no feast, no guests. She brought her few belongings, settled into the routine, and began her duties. Cooking, cleaning, mending, helping in the fields. The work was the same, only the roof above her head had changed. The new husband was expected to treat her well, not because of any law, but because of what people would say. A man who mistreated his new wife risked losing her, or worse, losing the respect of his neighbours. In small communities, reputation was important. A man needed help from others, for harvest, repairs, emergencies. If he was known as cruel or unfair, he would find fewer willing hands when he needed them. Most couples seem to have stayed together after the sale. There are few records of second sales or public disputes. This suggests that, in many cases, the arrangement worked well enough. The woman had a home, the man had a partner, they shared the load of daily life. Arguments happened, as they do in any household, but there is little evidence of widespread unhappiness. Children born after the sale were treated as the new husbands. No questions were asked. The past was not discussed. The village accepted the new family as it would any other. If the woman had children from the first marriage, they usually stayed with her, and the new man took on the role of stepfather. In some cases, the old husband remained nearby and still helped, especially if the children were young. The change was not always dramatic. In many ways, life looked the same. The woman still rose early, worked hard, and followed the seasons. The difference was in the atmosphere. Whether the man was kind, whether the home felt safer, whether the food was shared without anger. These small things mattered more than any grand gesture. There was no official record of the new union, no certificate, no church blessing, no legal document. But it was recognised all the same. The couple were referred to as man and wife. They lived as such. Neighbours treated them as such. Over time, the oddness of how they came together faded. It became just another story, mentioned once and then forgotten. Some women may have been better off. If the first husband was harsh, drunk, or neglectful, the new one might have been calmer, more responsible, or simply more willing to share the work. One account describes a woman who, after the sale, was seen smiling more, speaking freely, and taking part in village events she had once avoided. No one said it directly, but it was clear she preferred her new life. Men also benefited. A lonely man gained companionship, help, and a sense of order. A household ran more smoothly with two people. Meals were cooked, clothes were washed, the fire was kept. These were not small things. They made the difference between a home and a hut. The practice did not bring happiness in the way stories describe it. There were no love matches, no grand passions, but it brought stability. It allowed people to leave a bad situation and try another without scandal or long conflict. It was not fair, not equal, not modern, but it was practical. Villages did not judge harshly. Life was hard for everyone. People understood that choices were limited. A woman who left a cruel man, even through a strange custom, was not seen as wrong. A man who gave up a marriage that was not working was not seen as weak. They were just people, doing what they could. No songs were written about these couples. No paintings made. Their lives were ordinary, quiet, and unrecorded. But in their small way, they found a path through a system that offered none. They did not break the rules loudly. They bent them quietly, without making a noise. The rope was not used again. The market moved on. The chickens were sold. The boots were tried on. The rain fell as usual. And in a small house on the edge of the village, a woman sat by the fire, mending a shirt, while a man read from a book. It was not perfect, but it was peace. And for many, that was enough. The practice of selling wives faded slowly, not with a ban or a speech, but because the world changed around it. Villages grew into towns, roads improved, more people moved to cities where old customs meant less. The law became clearer, more present, and less willing to ignore odd habits just because they had always been that way. Courts began to see wife selling not as a village matter, but as something that needed stopping. By the 18th century, reports of such sales became less common. When they did happen, they were more likely to be noticed, questioned, or even punished. Newspapers, now more widespread, wrote about them with disbelief. They called the practice backward, shameful, a sign of ignorance. The tone was firm, moral, and certain. There was no room anymore for quiet acceptance. Police were told to intervene. Magistrates refused to ignore it. One case in the early 1800s ended with the husband fined and the sale declared void. The judge said it had no place in a civilized society. The woman was not returned to her first husband. She was left free, which was something new. For the first time, the system offered not just an end to a bad marriage, but a way out without replacing one man with another. Divorce, though still rare and difficult, became possible for more people. It required money, evidence, and patience, but it existed. Separation orders allowed couples to live apart legally. The church slowly adapted, though reluctantly. The idea that marriage was unbreakable began to weaken, not in doctrine, but in practice. Wife-selling didn't end because it was suddenly seen as cruel. It ended because it was no longer useful. When better ways to leave a marriage appeared, people stopped using the old one. They didn't need a rope and a market when a court could do the job, even slowly. The last known cases happened in the late 1800s. By then they were treated as curiosities, almost jokes. A man in Dorset sold his wife for £1 in 1870. A crowd gathered, someone took a photo, and the local paper wrote about it as if it were a carnival act. The constable arrived, stopped it, and the couple were sent home. No one was charged. But the message was clear. This was no longer done. These final acts were not serious. They were more like echoes, people repeating a habit they had heard about but didn't fully understand. The meaning had been lost. The quiet purpose to escape without scandal, to start again, was buried under laughter and disbelief. And yet, in its time, the practice had served a need. It was never kind or fair in the way modern ideas demand. It was not based on equality or rights, but it allowed movement where there was none. For people with no voice in court, no money for lawyers, no support from family, it was a way to change their lives when nothing else worked. It was clumsy. It used symbols that now seem absurd. The rope, the market, the few coins. But it was real. And in a world that offered no proper exit from a broken marriage, it became a door, even if it was crooked and poorly made. The women who went through it were not passive objects, not always. Some may have suffered, some may have been forced, but others likely saw it as a chance, a quiet escape from something worse. The men who bought them were not all masters or tyrants. Some were kind, lonely, or simply trying to make a life that worked. No one praised the custom. No one wrote history books to defend it, but it existed not because people were cruel, but because they were practical. When rules fail, people make their own. They use what is at hand: a rope, a shilling, a word in front of neighbours. Today the idea seems strange, even ridiculous, but it came from the same need people still have: to leave what hurts, to find peace, to try again. The methods have changed. The laws are better. The world is different, but the reason remains the same. When life is hard and choices are few, people find a way. Not always a good way, not always a right one, but a way. And sometimes that is all they can do.
In times when seas were yet uncharted and horizons seemed like the edge of existence, Egypt was ruled by a king who liked to call himself brother of a brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Not because he had enough brothers to fill an army, but because he believed knowledge, like family, should never be left alone. Somewhere in the heart of Alexandria, between the bustling port and the gleaming white temples, he dreamed of building a place where all human wisdom would gather. Not that of gods or warriors, but of reason itself. The idea, of course, wasn't new. Like most brilliant ideas, it was born from greed. The king wanted a library, but not the kind that stored scrolls of taxes or slave inventories. He wanted to collect everything: Babylonian laws, Indian healing recipes, Phoenician sailors' songs, even the silly poems lovers wrote under palm trees. To achieve this, he devised a trick worthy of a carpet merchant. Every ship arriving in Alexandria had to surrender its books for temporary safekeeping. Guards searched the holds as thoroughly as if they were hunting stolen princesses. If they found a text, it was immediately taken to the library, where scribes copied it until their fingers turned black with ink. The original was kept in the king's treasury, and the merchant received a copy with the inscription, "Donated to the Library of Alexandria." Merchants, of course, grumbled. One Phoenician, whose grandmother had once recorded how to tame storms with songs, nearly started a riot at the dock. He stood waving his arms like a windmill and shouting that his ancestors had guarded these secrets for generations, and now they'd be taken like the last fig from a starving camel. But when he was handed a bag of gold for his donation, his anger melted faster than snow in the desert. So it went. Merchants' fury turned into a sly smile. Some began slipping fake scrolls into their chests with nonsense like how to turn sand into water, hoping to earn gold for empty chatter. Others hid valuable manuscripts in barrels of olive oil, unaware that guards had learned to sniff out the scent of ink even through resin. The library itself grew like the Nile in flood season. Its halls resembled a labyrinth where every turn led to a new wonder. Here lay Babylonian astronomers' tables that could predict eclipses as easily as a housewife foretold rain. There, instructions from Egyptian doctors on how to reset a dislocated jaw with a stick and rope. Sometimes odd things turned up. A scroll on growing gold from clay. The author had clearly drunk too much Phoenician wine. Or notes from a Persian poet who spent 3 days describing how beautifully a rose petal fell. The king, however, didn't distinguish between valuable and worthless texts. For him, one thing mattered. If a single handwritten word existed somewhere in the world, it had to end up here. The copying process became a craft, almost a religion. In the library's cellars, where the air smelled of lavender to keep moths away, and lamp oil, scribes worked. Their hands moved as quickly as if afraid the ink would dry before they could capture the wisdom of the ages. Young apprentices holding reed pens for the first time often stained their fingers and scrolls, while senior masters sighed like grandmothers watching their grandchildren's mischief. One such youth, Sosibius, became famous for mixing up letters in Euclid's formula and writing square hippopotamus instead of square of the hypotenuse. Scholars debated for a week whether the Greek had discovered square hippos until someone noticed a wine stain on the scroll. From then on, Sosibius was made to write in gloves, and he wore them even in his sleep. But not everything ran smoothly. One day, a fire broke out in the port. Someone dropped a lamp near a barrel of oil. Flames crept toward the warehouse where fresh scrolls were stored, scrolls not yet copied. Scholars ran about like headless chickens, trying to save what they could. Someone threw a stack of manuscripts straight into the Nile, hoping water would stop the fire. Later, when the panic subsided, they fished out the soggy scraps, but the ink had bled, turning wise thoughts into abstract patterns. Then an elderly Egyptian priest stepped in, the kind who had probably been waiting for this moment his whole life. He suggested mixing ink with acacia sap, a plant growing in the desert. It turned out thick as clay and unafraid of water or time. From then on, all important texts were written with this mixture, and the priest received a lifetime supply of figs and the right to sleep in the library on a mat of palm leaves. Over time, Alexandria became not just a port, but a giant vacuum cleaner for knowledge. Merchants from distant lands, hearing that books were paid for in gold, began deliberately bringing scrolls, even if they previously only carried spices and slaves. One Greek trading olive oil hired a poet to write an ancient manuscript overnight about a hero who defeated a sea monster with a spoon. Guards believed it, took the scroll to the library, and the merchant got his gold. Later, it turned out the poet had simply rewritten the story of Perseus, replacing the sword with a spoon. But the king wasn't even angry. He decided humor was also part of human wisdom. Not everyone welcomed this enterprise with enthusiasm. In Athens, for instance, philosophers turned up their noses. What were Greek thoughts doing rotting in Egyptian dust? But when they learned the Library of Alexandria held original works by Aristotle that had already rotted from rain in Athens, their pride softened somewhat. Even Romans, usually dismissive of foreign books, sent a messenger requesting a copy of the legal code. Their own records seemed to have vanished into Senate dust. The library grew, but so did its problems. Scrolls multiplied so fast that a storage system had to be devised. At first, they were stored in jars like grain, but mice quickly learned to gnaw through clay. Then wooden shelves were built, but sea humidity made the planks swell, and scrolls curled up like frightened snakes. Finally, following a Babylonian architect's advice, stone niches with sand at the bottom were constructed. Sand absorbed moisture, and scrolls lay as if in a pharaoh's tomb. Each library section got its color: green for medicine, blue for astronomy, red for poetry, though poets were offended to be mixed with blood. Sometimes texts arrived that even the king lost his composure over. For example, a scroll in a strange language where birds and fish replaced letters. Scholars puzzled over it for 3 months until they realized it was an Indian cipher where each bird represented a syllable. or a papyrus with a formula for eternal youth, written so small it had to be read through an ice magnifying glass. Later, it turned out to be just a wine recipe. But by then, the king had already ordered ice spectacles for the entire court. Over time, the library became more than a book repository. Scholars gathered here to debate whether Earth was flat or round, whether the distance to the moon could be measured, and whether water turning into wine was even believable. Sometimes arguments turned into fights. Once, an astronomer and a geographer nearly killed each other because the first drew a map without desert, and the second claimed desert was a myth. The king, hearing about it, merely smirked. Let them fight. While they argue who's right, we'll collect both versions. But the biggest problem wasn't arguments or mice. Knowledge, like wine, changed taste over time. Scribes copying scrolls sometimes added their comments, or worse, skipped entire paragraphs, deciding they were obvious nonsense. A philosophical treatise on the nature of the soul reached posterity with a marginal note. The author clearly drank too much. Souls can't be blue. A plague remedy recipe acquired notes like, "Try adding garlic, worked for my aunt." The king, learning of this, issued a new decree. All comments must be written in red ink so they'd be visible. Thus, the world's first standard for scientific annotations was born. By the end of Ptolemy's reign, the library had become legend. Merchants joked that if a single word existed anywhere not written on papyrus, it would still find its way to Alexandria. Once, a ship arrived from an unknown island, and the captain gifted the king a scroll woven from spider silk. It showed stars and strange symbols. Scholars spent 3 years trying to decipher it. Was it a map of distant islands or just a madman's drawing? It turned out to be a letter from Polynesian islanders who navigated by stars. But by then, the ship had long sailed away, and the captain had probably forgotten why he'd done it. So the library grew, not perfect, not flawless, but alive. It contained mistakes, deceptions, silly jokes, and brilliant discoveries. But every line, even the most absurd, reminded, knowledge isn't just truth. It's also the people who write it, copy it, lose it, and find it again. The king, perhaps, didn't know that one day this labyrinth of scrolls would burn, crumble to dust, or sink into sand. But in those years when Nile dust mixed with ink and scholars' laughter drowned out the sea's roar, Alexandria was the closest place to what people call eternity. Sometimes, though, eternity smelled of lavender and rancid oil, and tomorrow would be a new day. New scrolls. New mistakes. But that was another story. If the library's first problem was gathering books, the second was realizing knowledge doesn't always wear a toga or sit in chests. Sometimes it hides in desert sands, in old priests' whispers, or in drawings on clay shards. King Ptolemy, seeing how quickly the library's halls expanded, suddenly understood. What if somewhere far away, beyond his port, secrets lay hidden that he couldn't even imagine? Like in Babylon, where astronomers predicted falling stars, or in India, where doctors removed tumors and stitched wounds with monkey intestine thread. So he gathered the boldest, the most cunning, those who could fool even a fox if the fox could read. These people didn't wear armor or carry swords. Their weapons were bags of Egyptian linen, bottles of wine, and the ability to lie as if telling the truth. They were nicknamed collectors. though in essence, they were thieves in silk. The first mission was sent to Babylon, the city where towers reached for the sky and scholars knew more than gods. Ptolemy chose 3, Callimachus, who could memorize an entire scroll at a glance, Lysander, a master of spontaneous storytelling, and young Theocritus, who still confused left with right, but could go a month without eating if asked. The road to Babylon was long, first up the Nile by boat, then across the desert on donkeyback. The desert, as always, didn't appreciate haste. Sand got into bags, water ran out faster than promised, and at night, the cold forced them to sleep huddled like puppies. But the collectors comforted themselves. If they died, their names wouldn't be recorded in the library, and that was worse than death. When they reached Babylon, the city greeted them with the scent of cinnamon and clay. Here, knowledge wasn't stored on papyrus, but on clay tablets, durable as Babylonian officials' temperaments. To access them, the collectors devised a plan worthy of a drunk poet. Lysander declared himself an envoy of the Egyptian king bringing gifts. Callimachus, disguised as a priest, began interpreting dreams on the streets to gather followers. And Theocritus, the most useless of the 3, handed out sweets made of figs and almonds to children, hoping they'd lead him to scholars' homes. Within a week, they knew everything: where astronomical tables were kept, how Babylonian sages counted years, and most importantly, that local officials hated being reminded their great city had once been destroyed. Then Lysander took a risk. He appeared at the temple of Marduk with a bag of linen, the finest in the world, used to swaddle Pharaoh's infants. King Ptolemy gifts this to the god, he announced. But if your priests refuse, we'll take it to Syria. Their gods, they say, have sensitive skin. The priests, of course, couldn't resist. The linen was too good to refuse. In exchange for 10 pieces of cloth, they gave the collectors a bundle of clay tablets with eclipse tables, star lists, and even instructions on building towers so they wouldn't collapse. Later it turned out the last part was a joke. Babylonians themselves didn't know why their towers fell. But the collectors didn't ask. They packed the tablets in straw-filled sacks like fragile wine and headed further, to India, where, according to rumor, doctors stitched wounds so well no scars remained. The road to India proved worse. Deserts gave way to jungles where trees clung to the sky and snakes were longer than Theocritus's patience. In one city, they were nearly eaten by tigers. In another, almost drowned in a river mistaken for spies. But the worst awaited them in the Raja's capital, a city where gold was cheaper than clay, and doctors operated so quickly, patients didn't have time to get scared. The collectors learned the Raja possessed a scroll, ancient, parchment, written in a language resembling bird tracks. It described operations Egyptian doctors considered nonsense: removing kidney stones, mending broken bones with wooden splints, even restoring sight to the blind. But the Raja guarded it like treasure, and taking it by force meant inviting the wrath of 1,000 warriors. So Lysander devised a new lie. He announced King Ptolemy had sent the Raja the world's rarest wine, actually ordinary Phoenician wine laced with a sleeping potion Callimachus learned from Egyptian priests. At the feast, the Raja drank 3 cups and fell asleep like a baby. While his servants danced and sang, the collectors sneaked into the treasury. There, among ivory and jewels, lay the scroll tied with a silk ribbon. Theocritus, trembling with fear, stuffed it under his robe, and Callimachus, just in case, hid a couple of math books. Might come in handy. But as they left the palace, they walked into an ambush. It turned out the Raja had woken up early and noticed the theft. Warriors surrounded the collectors at the city gates. Lysander, as always, began talking about friendship between nations, how the scroll was a gift from the gods, that they'd only temporarily borrowed it for copying. But the Raja wasn't convinced. Then Callimachus did what he should have done long ago. He threw the scroll into Theocritus's hands and shouted, "Run!" Theocritus ran. Through narrow alleys, past shouting traders, across a bridge over the river. Arrows whistled past, but he didn't stop. Only when the city was behind him did he hide the scroll in a staff, specially hollowed out like oars on a boat. Then he sat on the ground and cried. Because he knew Callimachus and Lysander wouldn't catch up. They didn't. They were caught. Lysander was executed for deception. Callimachus was thrown into prison. But before dying, he scratched star coordinates into the wall so someone might one day find their path. And Theocritus, alone with his staff, walked through the desert. Water ran out. Cracks appeared on his skin like on a clay pot. Sometimes he thought he heard Lysander's laughter or Callimachus's cough, but it was just the wind playing with sand. When he reached Alexandria, they barely recognized him. His cloak had turned to rags, his face was crusted with salt, and he clutched the staff like his last hope. King Ptolemy personally met him in the library. Theocritus silently pulled out the scroll and placed it on the table. Then he collapsed. Scholars rushed to the manuscript. Indian letters danced before their eyes, but they knew it was worth it. The scroll was translated, copied, displayed in the medicine hall, and Theocritus's staff was placed in a corner, a memorial to those who didn't return. From then on, people in Alexandria said, "Not all books come by ship. Some come from the desert, from jungles, from roads where those who brought them died." And every time a scribe picked up a new scroll, he remembered. Behind every line lay someone's life, someone's lie, someone's hope. But not all missions ended tragically. Once, a Chinese merchant arrived at the library, with silk, porcelain, and a scroll where birds replaced letters. Scholars puzzled over it for 3 months until they realized it wasn't language, but music. Each bird was a note. They played the melody on a lyre, and the hall filled with the scent of flowers that never grew in Egypt. The king ordered the scroll placed next to astronomical tables. "Let stars and notes be friends," he said. And a year later, a ship from Africa arrived at the port, with a box full of black beans. "For alertness," explained the merchant. In the library, they tried the beans, brewed them in water, and named the drink coffee. Now scribes worked through the night without falling asleep from fatigue. So the collectors continued their work. Some returned with gold and glory, some with empty hands, some didn't return at all. But every mission reminded one thing. Knowledge doesn't ask permission to enter the world. It comes when sought. Even if it means deceiving a Raja, fleeing warriors, or walking through the desert with only a staff. Sometimes, though, knowledge came on its own. Once, an old fisherman wandered into the library and brought a papyrus found in a fish's belly. It showed a map of a non-existent island. Scholars decided it was a joke, but 100 years later, Columbus used the same map to find America. And Theocritus? he stayed in Alexandria, became keeper of the medicine hall, taught young scribes how to read Indian letters. And every evening before sleep, he'd take Callimachus's staff and whisper, "We brought back your scroll. Now it's your turn." But the wind never answered. The wind never answers. And somewhere in the desert, a hollow staff waited for the next hand to pick it up. Picture this. Morning. First sunbeams barely touch Alexandria's rooftops, while lamps already burn in the library's cellars. There, where it smells of lavender, dust, and something sweet. Perhaps souring wine, perhaps hope. Here, in the House of Scrolls, copies of those very secrets are born, the ones arriving by ship or brought from deserts. And here, between reed pens and ink blots, lies the quietest yet most important work in the world. Scribes aren't heroes. Their names aren't carved on temple walls. They aren't mentioned in songs. But without them, everything we know about antiquity would long ago have turned to ash. Their task is simple. Transfer letters from one papyrus to another. But simplicity is deceptive. Try writing symbols you don't understand for hours, keeping your hand steady as a taut string without mixing inks. And don't fall asleep. Because if the pen slips, the mistake remains forever, like a scar on an immortal's face. Let's start with morning. Lamplight flickers, casting shadows on walls. Tables covered with papyri resemble battlefields. Here and there, traces of man's struggle with letter. Somewhere the pen pierced the papyrus. Somewhere ink bled like blood. And in this chaos, silence. Only the scratch of pens, rustle of pages, and an occasional sigh from a tired master. Sometimes someone sneezes, and everyone jumps as if startled by a snake. Among newcomers is Sosibius, a youth with ink-stained fingers and eyes full of hope. He's been here only a month but already knows. Copying isn't the same as reading. Reading is like drinking water, simple, natural. Copying is like catching fish in the dark. Sometimes you catch a pearl, sometimes a stone. Yesterday, he mixed up 2 letters in Euclid's formula and wrote square hippopotamus instead of square of the hypotenuse. Scholars debated for a week whether the Greek had discovered square hippos until someone noticed a wine stain on the scroll. Today, Sosibius writes in gloves and wears them even in his sleep. Beside him sits Demetrius, an old master whose fingers are crooked from work, whose eyes see letters even in darkness. They say he began writing before Ptolemy built the library. His hands move like mechanisms, every motion precise, every line perfect. But today he isn't writing. Today he's teaching. Look, he whispers to Sosibius, pointing at a scroll. Here's a dot, tiny, nearly invisible. If it's missing, the whole meaning vanishes, like saying, "The king loves bread," instead of, "The king loves bread." Imagine what happens if bread runs out. Sosibius nods, but thinks only of breakfast. Demetrius notices. "You think knowledge is about the mind," he continues. Number knowledge is about hands, about not flinching while writing, about remembering every letter is like a drop of water in the Nile. One disappears, the river becomes shallower. Sosibius nods again, but in his head, only breakfast. The day drags slowly. Sun climbs higher, lamps go out, but it's still dark in the cellar. Scribes change positions, rub stiff necks, drink water from clay jugs. Sometimes someone falls off their chair from exhaustion, and everyone laughs because laughter here is rare as rain in the desert. By noon, Sosibius finishes a page, looks at it proudly. No blots, no mistakes. But Demetrius takes the scroll, squints, and quietly curses. Here it should be 3, he points at a numeral. You wrote 2. But so it's almost the same, Sosibius mumbles. Almost the same is like almost alive, Demetrius snaps. There's no almost in science. He takes a cloth, erases the mistake, and makes Sosibius rewrite it 3 times, until his hand remembers. After lunch comes the hardest part. They bring a new scroll, Aristotle's treatise on animals. Text on brittle papyrus, letters faded, blurred in places. Scribes frown. Reading this is like deciphering a cipher. Sosibius takes it. Hands tremble, but he's focused. Gradually, letters form words. And since the horse's soul differs from man's, suddenly he freezes. In the text, a strange word. Not Greek, not Egyptian. Looks like a typo. He asks Demetrius. The old man studies the line for a long time, then snorts. That's not a typo. It's an Indian word. Means is soul. Aristotle must have read about it somewhere. But how did it get here? Who knows those Greeks? Demetrius sighs. Maybe a merchant sold a fake. Maybe Aristotle himself got confused. But our job isn't to think. Our job is to write. And Sosibius writes. Even if he doesn't understand. Even if his hand aches. Because that's the House of Scrolls rule. If text exists, it must be preserved. Even if it's wrong. Even if it's foolish. Even if it says the earth rests on 3 elephants. By evening, disaster strikes. One senior scribe, Philon, discovers an error in a copy of Euclid's Elements. Instead of parallel lines never meet, it reads, parallel lines meet in Ptolemy's house. This isn't just a mistake. It's a nightmare. Because now every scholar reading this scroll will think Euclid believed in miracles. And the king, by the way, isn't thrilled when his house gets compared to geometry. Philon runs between tables like a tailless monkey. Who's to blame? Who allowed such stupidity? Turns out the culprit is the newcomer, the same one who wrote about square hippos yesterday, Sosibius. He's summoned before Demetrius. The old master looks at him as if seeing through. Do you know what this means? He asks. Sosibius stays silent. It means that in 100 years, someone will read this and decide Euclid was mad, or that Ptolemy is a god. Maybe both. But I didn't mean to. Nobody means to. But mistakes happen. The question is what to do with them. Demetrius takes the scroll, tears out the ruined page, and throws it into the fire. Flames devour the words, and Sosibius feels something burning inside him too. Now you'll rewrite it, and you won't leave until it's perfect. Night. Everyone's gone except Sosibius. The lamp flickers, ink dries, and he writes. Line after line. Once, 10 times, 100 times, until the letters become what Euclid intended. By morning, he finishes, places the scroll on Demetrius's table. The old man checks it, silently nods, and smiles for the first time. Now you understand? He asks. What? That every letter is like a drop of water in the Nile. Sosibius nods, and for the first time feels he's not just writing, he's preserving. The next day, the king visits the library, not to praise, to ask, why in a star chart instead of coordinates are there drawings of monkeys? It turns out one collector returning from India decided monkeys were a new alphabet. Scholars laugh, scribes sigh, and Sosibius thinks, maybe knowledge isn't just formulas and maps. Maybe it's also monkeys that accidentally made it into history. But today he won't make a mistake. Today he'll write so that in 1,000 years someone can read his lines and understand. Here was a man who knew, Every letter matters, because knowledge doesn't die. It just waits to be written correctly. And tomorrow will be a new day. New scrolls, new mistakes. But that's another story. Night. Alexandria's port usually buzzed until dawn. Creaking rigging, sailors' shouts, the smell of fish and salty wind. But this night, noise turned to fire's crackle. Someone dropped a lamp near an oil barrel. Or perhaps the gods decided to test how much King Ptolemy loved his books. Whatever the cause, flames crawled along the docks like a snake across sand, swallowing ships, chests, dreams. And in the holds, between wheat sacks and fig crates, lay fresh scrolls, those not yet copied, those for which collectors died in the desert. Panic erupted in the library. Scholars, usually calm as pharaoh statues, ran about like headless chickens. Some raced to the port with buckets of water, some to the scrolls, some just stood watching flames lick the stars. Sosibius, the scribe who nearly fell asleep over Euclid's Elements the night before, grabbed the first thing at hand, a bundle of papyri with Indian healing recipes, and sprinted to the Nile. There, without thinking, he threw them into the water. If fire doesn't reach them, water will stop it, he decided. But water stopped not the fire, but the letters. Ink bled, turning wise lines into abstract patterns. When Sosibius fished out the scrolls next morning, only bird-like stains remained. Not everyone was so foolish. Demetrius, the old scribe master, instead of water-grabbed sandbags. He knew, humidity destroys papyrus, but sand absorbs moisture like a sponge. Scrolls packed in bags were carried to safety, into Serapis temple cellars, where even mice feared to rustle. But sand didn't save everything. Fire reached the warehouse storing Babylonian clay tablets. They'd have survived the fire, but not the panic. In the chaos, someone dropped the stack, and tablets scattered like dice. Now even astronomers couldn't reconstruct the eclipse table from shards. By morning, the fire died. The port resembled a battlefield. Charred planks, ash instead of sand, the smell of soot that seemed embedded in skin. Scholars stood among ruins like lost children. Sosibius looked at the wet scrolls in his hands and thought, "It's over. Knowledge has gone into the Nile like Pharaoh's ashes." But then an old man emerged from the crowd. Not a scholar, not a soldier, an Egyptian priest who used to carry water to the library and sleep on a palm leaf mat. His name was Imhotep, but everyone called him the Fourth because he was the fourth in his line with that name. He approached the wet scrolls, took one, turned it in his hands, and smirked. Not maliciously, but as if he knew this would happen. Then he pulled something like dry grass from his bag and said, "Acacia sap. Smear it on ink. Won't wash off even in a flood." Everyone fell silent. Acacia sap? Desert grass? But the priest didn't explain. He simply coated ink on a papyrus scrap, dipped it in water, and the letters remained sharp as a sphinx's smile. It turned out the priest had known this for a long time. His grandfather used acacia sap for tomb inscriptions, so writings wouldn't fade over 1,000 years. But his grandfather wasn't a scholar. He was what Alexandrians called an ordinary man. And ordinary people, it turned out, sometimes knew more than those wearing togas and quoting Aristotle. Within a day, the library lived again. Not as before. Now every corner smelled of smoke and fresh paint, but it lived. Scribes worked non-stop, mixing ink with acacia sap. Sosibius, who yesterday threw scrolls into the Nile, now taught newcomers. Coat the brush twice. First layer for the letter, second for eternity. Even mice, usually delighted by chaos, hid away. Something unfamiliar smelled in the air. But not everyone rejoiced. Some scholars grumbled, "Why do we need this desert grass?" Greek ink was fine. But when a new scroll survived rain, yes, Alexandria occasionally had rain, rarely, but enough to test, grumbling turned to silence. Within a week, King Ptolemy ordered, all important texts must be written with acacia sap. Priest Imhotep IV was rewarded with a bag of figs and the right to sleep in the library. Not on a mat, but on a real reed mat. The fire became a turning point. Not just because inks changed, because everyone understood knowledge is fragile. It perishes not only from fire, but from water, wind, human stupidity who throws a scroll into a river thinking it saves it. Now new rules appeared in the library. No scrolls in the port without protection. All copies in 2 sets. And most importantly, if you think you know everything, you've already made a mistake. Once Sosibius asked Demetrius, "Why didn't we use acacia sap before?" The old master just sighed. Because before the fire, we didn't know it would come. It wasn't an answer. But perhaps the most honest one. Soon, a new scroll arrived from Carthage, showing ships and strange symbols. Scribes, now experienced, coated it with acacia sap and placed it in a sand-filled niche. But a month later, they discovered ink cracked. It turned out acacia sap doesn't mix with salt, so they devised mixing it with olive oil. When the oil began to turn rancid, they added a drop of wine. Thus, a recipe survived to our days. The fire didn't destroy the library. It changed it. Now knowledge wasn't just stored. It was learned to be protected. Special jars for scrolls appeared, which could be buried in sand. Underground storage began construction, where even fire couldn't reach. And at the port, guards with buckets were stationed, just in case. But most importantly, people stopped thinking knowledge was eternal. They understood every book, every scroll is a battle with fire, water, one's own stupidity. And victory can only be achieved by remembering today's mistake, tomorrow's ash. When fire broke out again in the port a year later, this time due to a sailor's joke with a lamp, scholars didn't run like chickens. They took buckets, sandbags, and new scrolls, those written with acacia sap. The fire died within an hour, and scrolls hidden in jars survived it, like pharaohs, for thousands of years. Sosibius, no longer a novice but not yet a master, looked at the smoke and thought, perhaps knowledge isn't what's written on papyrus. It's what remains when papyrus burns. Sometimes, though, only ash remains. But even ash can tell a story. And in the desert where acacia grows, the wind whispers to old trees, "Save what you can. The rest will find its way." The Mouseion, not a temple, not a market, not a tavern. A place where thoughts clash like waves against rocks. Some shatter into dust, others find shore. Here, in the hall with columns where drafts whispered in 10 languages, scholars argued so fiercely scribes hid ink, lest chairs fly. Here swords weren't drawn, but words broke stronger than stone. And one day, an argument began not about how many stars were in the sky, but about the shape of Earth itself. It all started with a shadow. Eratosthenes, former poet and now library head, noticed, in Siena, now Aswan, on the summer solstice, the sun shines straight into wells, no shadow. But in Alexandria, there is a shadow. So Earth is round, he declared, and we can measure its circumference. For this, he needed scrolls from the library, Babylonian angle tables, Egyptian Nile maps, even Phoenician sailors' notes drawing the horizon as an arc. He took a stick, measured the shadow, calculated, and announced, Earth's circumference, 252,000 stadia, a figure that curled geographers' toes, but not everyone applauded. In a corner sat Aristarchus of Samos, a man who believed Earth was flat as a pancake, supported by 3 elephants, though elephants, in his view, stood on a tortoise, and the tortoise on something else. He didn't shout, didn't wave hands. Just placed on the table a worn scroll, Persian, written before Alexander the Great began conquering the world. It said, Earth is God's shield, heated and flat. Whoever claims otherwise lies or is drunk. Aristarchus smiled. Here's proof. Your calculations are dice games with gods. The argument exploded. Some shouted Eratosthenes was a genius, others that he'd drunk too much wine and now saw round wells in his sleep. Someone drew arcs, triangles, tortoises with periscopes on the floor. Others pointed fingers at scrolls, proving India knew truth while Babylon lied. Scribes, usually quiet as mice, began arguing louder than anyone. If Earth's round, like a scroll, people on the other side live upside down. No, they're like us, just their Nile flows the other way. And if we flip, will we fall into the sky? Eratosthenes didn't give up. He laid out papyri before the crowd. Cyane's shadow, angle calculation, a map where ships disappeared over the horizon like snails into a shell. But Aristarchus played his trump card. What if the shadow is light's deception? Or eyes lie? You trust paper, I trust gods. And then a scene began where even pharaoh statues seemed to cover their ears. Someone suggested testing it. Hire a ship, sail south until seeing ships disappear over the edge of the world. Others laughed. Fools, you'll fall into the abyss. No, you'll fall when Earth flips. Third parties demanded burning Eratosthenes' scrolls to stop confusing people. One philosopher, mixing up wine with medicine, began proving Earth was a giant watermelon, and we lived on its rind. King Ptolemy, hearing of the argument, came to the Mausion not as a ruler, but as a spectator. He sat in a column's shade, chewed a fig, and watched scholars tread the line between genius and madness. At one point, Aristarchus grabbed Eratosthenes' scroll and cried, "This is a lie! Let's throw it in the fire, and the argument ends!" The crowd froze. Fire, which recently nearly took thousands of scrolls, now could become judge of truth. But Ptolemy stood up. Not loudly, not threateningly, simply raised his hand, as those accustomed to being listened to do. "Throw the scroll in the fire," he said, "and you'll prove only one thing: fear of knowledge. I want both versions kept here. Let future generations decide who's right, because truth isn't about not making mistakes. Truth is about comparing mistakes." The crowd fell silent. Aristarchus lowered the scroll. Eratosthenes nodded. And at that moment, the argument stopped being war. Now it was dialogue. Since then, a new rule appeared in the library. If two versions of one truth exist, both must be kept. In the geography hall, next to the round Earth map, hung the Persian scroll about the flat one. Next to Eratosthenes' works, placed the watermelon philosopher's notes, though he was later expelled for trying to prove seeds were continents. Scribes began writing not just text, but comments. This is Aristarchus's opinion. This is Eratosthenes' calculation. This is a drunk poet's nonsense. But what if it's true? Arguments didn't cease. They became longer, louder, more interesting. Sometimes scholars argued so much they forgot to eat. Sometimes so much they dropped inkwells in anger. But now behind every argument lay the thought, what if tomorrow someone proves the opposite? One day, Eratosthenes and Aristarchus sat at the same table, not as enemies, but as two ships sailing in different directions, but knowing the sea is one. Eratosthenes drew a circle, Aristarchus a square. Then they added a black dot, the place where we don't know, and smiled. Because even in argument, common ground can be found. New sections began appearing in the library, not just geography or astronomy, but debates. There lay scrolls with opposing theories, fanned out like flower petals. Someone wrote about the sun revolving around Earth. Someone, the opposite. Someone proved lightning was God's anger. Someone, that it could be caught in a jar. Later it turned out it could. Scribes, who once feared mistakes, now took pride. This scroll is a mistake, but it's important. Even Sosibius, the scribe who feared writing 2 instead of 3, began adding margin comments. Author believes Earth is flat. I think he hasn't seen ships disappear over the horizon. But maybe he's right. Demetrius, the old master, only sighed. Mistakes used to be erased. Now they're collected. But the strangest thing happened a year later. Aristarchus, still believing in a flat Earth, asked Ptolemy's permission for an expedition. I'll prove the world's edge exists, he declared. The king agreed. Aristarchus sailed south and returned 3 months later. Not with proof of the world's edge, but with a new map. On it, the horizon was curved. Turns out, he said, I was wrong. But thanks to the library, it gave me a chance to err and redo. Eratosthenes smiled, not smugly, but like someone who knows. Winning an argument isn't about breaking the other. Winning is staying in the game. Since then, a tradition appeared in the Mousillon. Whoever brought a new theory had to write on the scroll. This may be untrue, but I believe truth is somewhere nearby. Scribes laughed. Now even mistakes are signed like poets. But they did it, because they understood. Knowledge grows not in silence, but in argument's noise. Sometimes arguments went too far. Once, 2 philosophers argued whether thought speed could be measured. One claimed thought was faster than light, the other slower than a snail. In the end, they held a race, sitting in a corner, thinking the same thing, while scribes noted whose hand first reached for ink. The winner was the one thinking about food, but even such foolishness left a trace, because in the library, foolishness wasn't feared. Only one thing was feared: arguments falling silent. Because silence is when everyone agrees, and agreement is death for knowledge. When a Roman envoy visited Alexandria 10 years later, he asked, "Why is it so noisy here?" In Rome, scholars speak quietly, like mice. Eratosthenes showed him the hall where 10 people shouted about the universe's shape and smirked, "Because mice fear cats, we don't." The envoy didn't get the joke, but wrote it in his notebook. Later, of course, lost it at the port. But someone found it and brought to the library. There it was, copied, with a comment. Author apparently confused mice and scholars. But what if he's right? So the library lived, not in sages' silence, but in argument's roar. Because every argument isn't an end. It's the start of a new line in a scroll no one has written yet. and beyond the Mausion's walls, the wind whispered, argue, error, copy. As long as there's a question, there's an answer, even if it lies in the next argument. In times when men believed women couldn't tell a scroll from a rag, and philosophers debated whether ladies had souls, a shadow appeared in Alexandria. Not the kind cast by columns at noon, but one that slipped between the library's shelves like a cat between soldiers' legs. Her name was Hatshepsut, a name she left in the past, along with skirts and perfumes. Now she was Harmon, son of an Egyptian merchant, scribe's apprentice, with ink-stained fingers and a gaze that avoided meeting others. Entering the library as a woman was as difficult as convincing the Nile to flow backward. There were no men-only rules here. They weren't needed. It was enough to look at togas-wearing scholars quoting Homer like market traders to understand. This was a place for those born with the right gender. But Hatshepsut knew, if you want to change something, start by becoming invisible. She cropped her hair, bound her chest with linen, rubbed dust on her face to hide soft features, and learned to walk so her step wouldn't reveal femininity. She also learned to cough loudly. Men did it every 5 minutes, as if proving they existed. Her first day in the library nearly became her last. She tripped over the threshold like a newborn calf and dropped a stack of scrolls. Scribes laughed. Here you go, Harmon. Even papyrus is heavier than your brain. She blushed, but remembered her mother's warning. If you blush, you're dead. Instead, she rudely replied, at least my brain isn't stuffed with straw like yours. Laughter grew louder, but now friendly. That's how she entered their world. Hatshepsut didn't seek glory. She came for one thing, a scroll written by her ancestors, Egyptian priestesses of Isis. It contained healing recipes known only to women, how to stop bleeding with tree bark, ease childbirth pain, heal wounds without scarring. Men's books spoke of war and gods, but were silent about surviving after it. This scroll was kept in the medicine hall, but access was limited to the chosen, those wearing white robes and shaving beards. For weeks, she observed, learned to recognize guards' footsteps, memorized when the chief keeper left for lunch, how wind rustled scrolls at noon. She noticed, every Friday, when sun hit windows, dust danced in the air, and guards fell asleep resting heads on tables. That's when she decided to act. At night, under moonlight, Hatshepsut crept into the medicine hall. Heart pounded so loudly it seemed mice could hear it. But mice, as usual, were busy, gnawing scroll edges. She found the right cabinet, shelf marked herbs and poisons. There lay a scroll tied with blue ribbon, Isis's color. Hands trembled, but she took it. Then heard footsteps. It was Zenodot, library head. Not young, not old, with a face lined like the Nile's map. He stood in the doorway, looking at her like an owl at a mouse. Hatshepsut froze. Thoughts flashed. Run, drop the scroll, shout, it's a mistake. But he didn't move. Just slowly approached, took the scroll from her hands, and unrolled it. Read several lines, then looked at her, not angrily, but as if seeing through the lie like thin papyrus. Next morning, Hatshepsut expected punishment. She should have been expelled, whipped, sent home in disgrace. But instead, Zenodot invited her to his office, placed a new scroll before her, blank, and pointed to a chair. She sat, trembling. He wrote, "Tomorrow you start copying. No mention of yesterday. No threats. Just a scroll and a chair. Later she understood. He'd known everything from the start. Her short nails, women painted theirs. Clumsy attempts to speak in a hoarse voice, lavender scent seeping through dust. But he stayed silent, because he saw how she studied complex formulas at night, erased mistakes until fingers bled, handled scrolls as if they were children. Since then, Hatshepsut stopped being Harmon. She remained in the library, but now, without mask. She wasn't greeted with applause. Some scholars left the hall when she entered. Others whispered, "A woman here?" She can't even hold a pen, but she held it tighter than many of them. Her first scroll, that very one with priestesses' recipes, was copied 10 times. It hung in the medicine hall next to Hippocrates' works. Only now it contained not just men's knowledge of bloodletting, but women's. How to heal wounds without prayers. Scribes who once laughed at her now asked to teach them reading Egyptian symbols. "How do you do it?" they asked. She replied, "Same way you do. Just look at paper, not your neighbor's chest." But not everything was smooth. Once in the geography hall, she spotted an error on a map. A river actually flowing east was drawn west. When she pointed it out, an old geographer snorted, "A woman teaching me science?" Next, you'll say the Nile flows upward. She silently produced a scroll with Caravanner's records showing, "It turns here. Because of mountains." The geographer looked and muttered, "Maybe you're right. But next time, stay silent until asked." She stayed silent. But not always. Sometimes, when scholars argued about the world's workings, she added her opinion. Not loudly, but clearly, like a drop of water in the desert, small but noticeable. Gradually, her voice was heard. Not because it grew louder, but because words were precise as a knife's strike. Once a scroll arrived from India about how children are born. Men's hands trembled copying it. "This is indecent. We're scholars, not midwives." Hatshepsut took the scroll and wrote in the margin, "If you don't know how children are born, how study their illnesses?" Scribes froze. Then one of them, the boldest, added, "And she's right." Since then, a new section appeared in the medicine hall, birth and life. Not everyone accepted the changes. In Athens, philosophers wrote angry letters. "You allow women access to knowledge?" What next? Horses ruling cities. In Rome, they joked, "Egyptians love cats so much. Now cats will become scholars." But in Alexandria, rains came, scrolls got damp, and Hatshepsut knew how to dry them. Arguments arose, and she found forgotten formulas in old texts. Gradually, her presence stopped being news. Now it was normal. Once Sosibius, the scribe who once mixed 2 and 3, asked her, "Why didn't Zenodot expel you?" She smiled, because he understood. Knowledge has no gender. It has a price, and the price is preserving it. Sosibius nodded. That same day, he wrote in his diary, "Today, Hatshepsut explained Egyptian hieroglyphs to me. Turns out they resemble birds. Should have asked earlier." Zenodot died 5 years later. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but quietly like a dying lamp. Before death, he gathered all library keepers, looked at Hatshepsut and said only, "Continue." She nodded and continued. Now she herself took new apprentices. Didn't ask whether man or woman stood before her. Asked, "Can you read? Can you write? Can you err and admit it?" Those answering yes received a chair and scroll. Others left whispering, "The library smells of lavender." Strange. Sometimes, of course, those rejecting change appeared. Once an old soldier entered the hall demanding removal of this woman from sacred space. Hatshepsut didn't argue, simply gave him a scroll with a scorpion sting remedy. "Read it," she said, "and say where the mistake is." The soldier read, frowned, then threw the scroll. "All correct, but I still disapprove." She smiled. "At least your wife will live. Approval comes second." Over time, the library became a different place. Not perfect, but alive. Here people argued, erred, copied, and knew. Whoever brings knowledge is a friend, even if he or she comes from shadow. Once a ship arrived from a distant land. Captain brought a scroll in an unknown language. Scholars puzzled over it for weeks. Then Hatshepsut took it, ran a finger over symbols and said, "This is my grandmother's language. She wrote this so men wouldn't understand." It turned out to be healing herb recipes from Red Sea shores. They were copied, added to the medicine hall, and the captain, learning a woman deciphered the scroll, laughed long. "In my country, women command ships." "And here," Hatshepsut replied, "knowledge commands." When a new king came to Alexandria years later, he asked, "Why so many women here?" They showed him the medicine hall where they taught young doctors. "Because," said an old scribe, "without them, you wouldn't have lived to ask this question." The king smirked and left, but next day sent a gift, a bag of lavender. So the library lived, not in silence ruled by prejudice, but in noise ruled by truth. Sometimes rough, sometimes gentle, but always its own. And wind in the windows whispered, "If knowledge is light, then shadow isn't an enemy. It only helps see where morning begins." In those years when the library no longer smelled only of lavender and ink, but also something fading, like old papyrus in sun, a special calm reigned there. Not the calm after storm, but the calm before sunset. Aristophanes, keeper of the philosophy hall, no longer rose from the mat by the window. His hands, once writing letters straighter than map lines, now trembled like leaves in wind. They said he was ill, but his illness was strange. Not fever, not wound, just time finally catching up with one who considered it a friend. One morning, a merchant stormed into the library, not like those arriving by ship, boasting scrolls for gold. This one was dirty as if he'd eaten dust for a week, smelling of fish long overdue for disposal. In his hands, he clutched a papyrus wrapped in a rag stained like wine or blood. "This is the last," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Scribes exchanged glances. Last what? Last apple? Last breath? But the merchant stayed silent until given a bag of silver. Then he threw the scroll on the table and left like a man who sold not just goods, but conscience. The scroll was old. No title, only a barely visible signature. Aristotle. Not the Aristotle whose works already lay in the philosophy hall, but the one who wrote so even gods probably stopped thinking while listening. But this wasn't metaphysics or Nicomachean ethics. It was a text no one knew. On the soul of animals. Aristophanes, hearing this, sat up for the first time in a month. His eyes, dull as embers after fire, suddenly lit up. He took the scroll like a newborn, afraid it would crumble to dust. And so it was. Papyrus crumbled under fingers. Letters faded, barely legible in places. But Aristophanes read. Read like one reading a dying friend's last words. Slowly, painfully, hoping to remember something. An hour later, he looked up. Tears on his face. Not from weakness, not from pain, from the realization the world had just learned. Aristotle wrote not only about humans, he wrote about how eagles think, why cats see in darkness, how bees find flowers, about how soul, not man's privilege, but a guest visiting all living things. Scribes standing around fell silent. They were used to arguments, mistakes, jokes about square hippos. But here there was no room for jokes. Here lay the end of one era and beginning of another. Aristophanes gave the order, not loudly, not royally, just whispered, "Copy it." In 3 days. In the library they knew. 3 days was time enough to achieve the impossible or die. Scribes nodded. They'd already seen how the old man looked at the scroll, like a farewell. Work began. Sosibius, who once mixed 2 and 3, now led the group. He chose the most skilled, those whose hands didn't shake, whose eyes still saw in darkness. The scroll was placed on a stand lit by lamps, not for warmth, but for light that might prolong the text's life. First page copied in an hour, but Aristophanes stopped them. Here's a mistake. Letter A written bolder than needed. Aristotle never wrote like this, he whispered. Had to erase and start again. Night. Lamps burned like stars in the desert. Scribes changed every 2 hours, but Aristophanes didn't sleep. He sat nearby, holding the scroll like its warmth could return letters to papyrus. Sometimes he pointed to a line, word missing here. Sometimes stayed silent, but his look said, "You didn't understand." One young scribe, nervous, dropped an inkwell. Dark stain spread across fresh text. Everyone froze. Aristophanes looked at the stain, then at the youth and said, "Now it's part of history," and smiled, for the first time in a week. By second night, Aristophanes lay down. Not to sleep, just closed eyes as if gathering strength. Scribes worked quieter, afraid to disturb his rest. But by noon, he sat up again. In his hands, the scroll. He kept reading, and suddenly froze. Fingers gripped papyrus, sweat beads on forehead. Sosibius ran over. Aristophanes pointed to a line. "This is important," and collapsed. They carried him to a tent by the library. The healer said, "He won't last till morning." But Aristophanes opened his eyes and whispered, "Till morning, we'll manage." No one asked what he meant. All knew it wasn't about him. Third day, final pages. Scroll crumbled faster than they wrote. Sometimes they had to piece fragments together like a puzzle to restore a word. One scribe, trying to speed up, wrote mouse instead of soul. Sosibius erased the mistake, but his hand shook. "If he dies while we err." Another, to stay awake, chewed tree bark, bitter as truth. Someone whispered prayers, though not believing in gods. By evening, the text was ready. Final line. For the soul of an animal is not man's shadow, but his mirror. Scribes folded the copy, placed it next to the original. Aristophanes, hearing this, asked for the scroll. He ran a finger over letters like a blind man reading through skin, then nodded, and died. No one cried. Not because there was no grief, but because at that moment all understood. Death isn't an end. It's just a pause between lines. Sosibius took the copy, carried it to the philosophy hall, and placed it next to Aristotle's works. The original was placed in Aristophanes' coffin. Let him take what he loved, Xenodot said. But the story didn't end. Next day, Eratosthenes came to the library. He took the copy, read it overnight, and declared, "This will change everything." And it did. Philosophers who once argued whether slaves had souls now asked, "Do ants have souls?" Doctors treating humans began studying how animals heal wounds. Even fishermen stopped considering birds stupid. They knew where to find fish. Sosibius, now philosophy hall keeper, sometimes took the scroll and thought, perhaps knowledge isn't what's written, it's what makes you search further. Once he noticed an error in the copy. On one page, cat was written as kitty. He didn't correct it. Let it stay. As a reminder, even in sacred text, human tremor finds its place. Years passed. The library grew, argued, burned, and revived, and the scroll on the soul of animals lay in the philosophy hall until one day a mad poet stole it. But a month later, he returned it, saying, "I thought it was a secret. Turned out it's truth." Sometimes, though, truth scares more than mystery, and in dust under the table where Aristophanes once sat, a papyrus fragment still lies. On it, one letter. Not A, not O, just a dot, like the start of a new sentence, or like a tear's trace. That night, when fire reached the port, the wind sang a song known only to ruined cities. Not a howl, not a scream. A quiet, sinister hiss like a snake slithering through ash. Ships burned like torches at a god's festival, and flames, caught by wind, already licked the library's walls. Someone dropped a lamp, or it was Caesar's gift. War rarely arrives with flower bouquets, but this time it came with fire. Sosibius, now no longer scribe but philosophy hall keeper, stood by the window watching the sky redden. His fingers, once trembling over scrolls, were now motionless as stone. He knew this wasn't just fire. It was the end. Not the kind coming with quiet sigh, but the kind crashing in with roar and leaving only questions behind. How many scrolls can we save? He thought. How many mistakes have we already made? How many more will we make? Panic erupted in the library. Not the morning kind when scribes rush to their tables, but the kind born when time clenches into a fist. Someone ran to the Nile with buckets, someone to scrolls, someone just stood watching fire like a verdict. Sosibius didn't run. He gathered those who still believed something could be saved. Not heroes, not warriors, men with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes. Take scrolls, he said, but not the easiest to reach. The ones most important to forget. First, Aristotle's works were hidden. Not metaphysics, not ethics, but that very scroll on the soul of animals. Aristophanes read before dying. It was wrapped in oil, placed in a clay jar, and buried under a palm tree by Serapis Temple. If found, Sosibius whispered, let them think it's wine. Nearby were hidden Indian recipes from Hatshepsut, Eratosthenes' map. Even that very scroll with monkeys the collector once mistook for alphabet. Everything that didn't fit in jars was packed in salt bags to keep sand from erasing letters. But not everything went as planned. One scribe, young and too proud, tried to carry too much. His bag tore, scrolls scattered across the floor. He tried gathering them, but fire was already close. In the end, he dropped everything and ran, leaving fingerprints on papyri like final greetings. Another, conversely, took only one scroll, on growing gold from clay. What if it's true, he thought, then threw it into the Nile. No, still nonsense. Sosibius calmly gathered his things. Not scrolls, he knew they couldn't be carried, but Aristarchus's staff, the very one who believed in flat earth, the staff where Theocritus once hid the Indian scroll. Now it was empty, but Sosibius felt emptiness, also memory. He checked if anyone remained in the halls, found an old scribe sitting hugging a scroll like a child. "Go," Sosibius said. "Your hands can still write." He shook his head. "My hands can do nothing now, but I won't leave." Sosibius didn't argue. Some choose to die with books, others with people. By morning, fire reached the library. Not all, part of the building survived like a tooth after battle, but enough to erase what people built over centuries. Scrolls that survived deserts and seas died from a spark fallen from sky. Somewhere burned eclipse tables, somewhere priestesses' recipes, somewhere silly notes about square hippos, all mixed in smoke like words in delirium. Sosibius stood on the shore watching the fire. In his hands, staff and a bag with final scrolls. He didn't cry. Not because there was no grief, but because grief, luxury for those still believing in endings. He knew, knowledge doesn't die. It just changes form. Sometimes becomes ash. Sometimes sand under feet. Sometimes words children repeat by the well. A week later, he sailed away. Not alone, with him were those still holding inkwells. Their ship was small as a thought, but held everything left. Scroll copies, argument records, even that very scroll with monkeys. Someone asked, "Where are we sailing?" Sosibius didn't answer. He just looked at the horizon where Earth curved like an arc. Years passed. The library turned to ruins. Sand covered its steps. Wind blew last letters from walls. Sometimes tourists came to Alexandria, pointed at charred columns saying, "This was the end." But there are no ends, only pauses. 100 years later, an archaeologist came to Alexandria. Not famous, not rich, just a man believing ash could tell a story. He dug where shelves once stood, finding papyrus fragments blackened by fire. One piece was so small it could hide in a palm. On it, just 2 letters. So. The archaeologist smiled. It was enough. 1,000 years later, a blog appeared online. A young man wrote about how ancient Greeks erred in mathematics. In comments, someone wrote, "Have you tried reading their scrolls?" The man laughed. "What scrolls? They've long been gone." But that same day, he found a scan in archives, a papyrus fragment marked Alexandria. On it, a formula he sought. Signature: Sosibius, error corrected. Knowledge doesn't disappear. It just waits. Sosibius died in a small island town. Not in a tomb, not with monument, but in a simple bed with papyrus in hand. Next morning, his staff lay by the door, and inside, a scroll written by his hand. It contained no wise thoughts, just one phrase. "If you're reading this, I haven't died." That scroll was copied, then again, and again. Today it lies in the new library, the one built where the old stood. Where fire once burned, lamps now shine. Where ash once smelled, now coffee aroma fills air. And everyone entering feels, this isn't the end, this is the beginning. Sometimes, though, beginnings come with mistakes. Once a student mixed letters and wrote knowing instead of knowledge. The teacher wanted to erase the error, but then changed his mind. "Let it stay," he said. "What if it's a new word?" So the library lives, not in stone, not in papyrus, but in people continuing to write. Even if hands tremble, even if ink dries, even if someone drops a lamp at the port. Because knowledge isn't what's stored on a shelf. It's what's passed hand to hand, like a torch in darkness. And in sand under ruins, a jar still lies. Inside, a scroll no one has found. Perhaps it'll be found tomorrow. perhaps in 1,000 years. Or maybe it's no longer important. Because what matters isn't where knowledge lies. What matters is that it exists.